Well, hi, good morning. Good morning to everyone, and thank you for being here. My name is Conrad Uribe. I am the Artistic Director of the Loop Festival and also the coordinator of the Loop Panels 2014. It's a pleasure to have you all here, and it's a pleasure to have the speakers that we have invited and that have accepted our invitation. So thank you all, and thank you in the first place to Harun Farocki and to Mark Nash, who will be opening the Loop Panel sessions today. We have entitled the Loop Panels 2014, as you can see there, Engaging Audiences, Issues on Dissemination of Moving Image Art. We have decided this title based on basically three things. The first one is an evaluation of what we've done so far, specifically in 2012 and 2013 editions of Loop Barcelona, where we have discussed issues around production or collaboration in the creativity field. And second, because we have identified the necessity of discussing, these issues and questions around audiences. So based on these two things, based on the evaluation of what we did in 2012 and 2013, as I said before, we tried to tackle issues around production and collaboration in the creativity field. We are trying to, or we are in a way making a turn, from the production creation field to the reception, circulation, and public field. So, and in the third place, we have also identified these sort of needs after discussing with colleagues and professionals that are close to Loop, who have told us about these questions and concerns on the public appropriation and public reception of video art and moving image artworks. So, based on these three main points of departure, we have identified these four main themes. We have entitled them, the first one, the power of moving image and the role of and the role of technologies in the dissemination of moving image. The second issue, or the second element, is release formats. We're going to have a panel discussion at 12 on release formats. Basically, the questions that we're asking ourselves is, what are they and what's its effectiveness towards the publics? The third main element, or the third main theme, is about audiences itself and how to develop artistic and institutional programs based on audiences. And then the first big element for this Loop Panels 2014 is on pedagogy and education. And we would like to discuss its importance, necessity, and role towards the publics. So, siguiente, por favor. This is the timetable for the Loop Panels. As I said before, we will be opening our sessions with this conversation between Harun Farocki and Mark Nash. This conversation is going to be taking about an hour or a bit more. It also depends on how engaged you are in this conversation, and it depends on your participation as well. So I really encourage you to participate and to take advantage of the fact take advantage of these two great speakers that we're having for this opening session. At 11:30, there is the press conference. It is taking place right out there, out of the auditorium. And then at 12, we're having a panel discussion on release formats. And as you can see, and as you already know, we're having a great list of speakers participating there. It's going to be moderated by Christine Van Asch. And as speakers, we will be having Jaap Gildemon, director of the iFilm Institute. We're having also Marcus Kreis from the Souvenirs from Earth TV channel. We're also having David Green, founding director of Art Projects, and Sherry Dobbin, director of Times Square Arts. So welcome you once again. Welcome, Mark. Welcome, Harun. Thank you very much for accepting this invitation, and please.
Great. Can you hear me with this slightly strange contraption? Is that, I have to say, yes, at the back? Yeah, good, okay. So I was saying to Harun, it feels like we've suddenly got 10 years older and we have to have an assisted kind of hearing, but actually it's assisted speaking that we're doing. which could well be a topic of one of Harun's films, the technology and sort of human capacity. What I thought I'd do is, I have a number of topics to discuss with Harun, which would then lead into the question of audiences, but maybe we need to take the clock back and think a little bit about the range of Harun's work, his aesthetics and his politics, in order to talk about his views on the present situation of video art and his own work in particular. So the first set of comments, I suppose, is to do with cinema, because I think we met, and I don't want to think exactly how long ago it was, but it would have been in the Edinburgh Film Festival in the late 1970s, early 1980s, where you were showing films. And Harun's work, I think, comes out of the same sort of constraints, or has the same formation as a number of filmmakers who are generally called the New German Cinema. This could include Ulrike Oettinger, Wim Wenders, Fassbinder, of course, and so on. Alexander Kluge also. So there's a very strong, independent, oppositional, critical film tradition in Germany at that time that you were very much part of. And I thought it might be worth just saying a few words now about what you think about that then and now. I mean, how do you see yourself as part of that movement? Do you think it has any connection to the present day? Because in some ways I see you as one of the few critical voices that still survives from that period, I would say.
Yeah, poor Fassbinder didn't survive, but
yeah, sure.
Perhaps he would still be or more oppositional nowadays.
Yes.
Also, so I was not really part of somehow. I was some years, only a few years younger, and I didn't find my way so early as Wim Wenders did. Also, so they had already shown their works mainly in America and had come into this academic circuit in the 70s, and for me that all started in the early 80s. So I'm not really part of this group, and also communication-wise, the names you have mentioned were not the people I was. Not so important, but of course, one is always an exchange with contemporary filmmakers or whatever, of course. So already in those days, already in the 70s, I would have been for a minute astonished about a word like the power of moving images. That reminds me of the heroic Siga Vertov times also. And already in the 70s, a different aspect, a different idea of power was prevalent for me and my friends. Not so much what you usually consider the power of cinematic images like montage, engagement, and so on, but something to read between the lines, what we call intellectual. Yeah? The intellectual is the one who can read between the words, between the lines. I like this old concept of special reading also. So therefore long takes and so on, where you where the attraction is not pre-created, the reader has to find it, and so on. That is somehow the power, and that has not changed so much. Of course, the topics have changed. Stylistically, it has changed. I hope I'm less dogmatic than I was in those days, but in general, that has not changed.
No. I mean, the other observation I was going to make about this time was that your work was more firmly rooted in a critical documentary tradition than the new German filmmakers that I've mentioned, because although you do use fictional devices in your work, I mean, you have characters performing different kinds of actions in some of the works, they're always part of some examination of the social forces which construct the event. So in that sense, you're more in the critical documentary tradition. which I thought was important. And the other factor, really just to remind the audience here, I suppose, is that this was the period in which a kind of the idea of critical reading, and in a sense it does connect to the question of engaging audiences, through, as Harun says, using long takes. I can remember when the first independent filmmakers started putting black space into their films in order to get the audience to reflect on what they'd just seen, and when they
to break the continuity, of course. Yeah.
To break the continuity of, so instead of an Eisensteinian montage where you'd go rapidly from one shot to another to create a sort of idea, instead you'd have a gap, or maybe there'd be a voiceover asking a question, and the audience was supposed to engage that way. And there was such a difference in the culture between the independent film culture and the mainstream culture that when they were first broadcast in the early 80s, the technicians said, oh, the transmitters will switch off if they have black. I mean, this is true. They thought that transmitting no images would be too radical a gesture. So things have come a very long way from there, I would say.
No, I also remember these technical ideas that it's impossible to transmit it because automatically they will open the aperture and close it again, when it's totally black. And the other thing was that television said it's impossible to show a silent film. It's technically not possible. And some years ago, when I made a silent film, somebody secretly told me that they have also broadcasted Jean Genet's Jean d'Amour. 5 years earlier at midnight. Nobody has realized it, and it worked also. And then they were prepared to broadcast my film also without music also. But the technicians always said it's just technically impossible.
And I suppose, I mean, that's in a way setting the scene for the present day, which is a very different kind of culture where you will can still have oppositional critical work, but it's happening both in the art spaces like here, it's happening on the internet, and it's also happening to some extent in the broadcast media. I wanted to talk also a little bit about, well, maybe I'll continue on the line of the critical engagement for a minute, because one of the other strong formations at that time was the work of Bertolt Brecht and his idea of a kind of critical reenactment. There's this one famous example is this street scene in which different performers all repeat what their view of an action. So in his plays, you don't get an authorial view setting out what has happened, but each character has a different view, and it often, in Brecht's case, corresponds to a class position. And Harun had, I was thinking of that because in one of the exhibitions you had in Berlin just now, which I think you also have here in Gallery Sender near the Magba, included a work where characters reenact or enact different positions. So an actor takes up different roles. In this case, it's criticizing the industrial production of armaments. I don't know if you want to say a little bit more about that.
So that's one of my earliest films from '69 about the company Dow Chemical, which was producing napalm. I don't know if they still do continue. Perhaps they have other means nowadays. So in this film, that was a very Brechtian film in which all the actors, as Brecht said, they should not pretend to be the characters, but to quote the characters they are performing for. And in the end, there was one person who said, I am an engineer, I am a worker, or I am a student, or whatever. And so he took 3 different positions, and somehow there was this kind of poetic permutation of his existence, also with some thesis, antithesis, synthesis steps also. And I think that not so many people have succeeded in making something out of Brecht for cinema. No. So Godard tried, the Straubs also tried, and probably one has to go further. Also, Brecht was not very successful in Hollywood, and not only because these bad producers didn't like him. Also, the scripts he produced were not amazingly interesting, and the one he produced with Fritz Lang was not a Brechtian, not a very Brechtian.
Hangman also.
Not a very Brechtian production, and it could have been better than it is, but it was still quite a normal narrative film, and had not so much to do with his ideas about telling history.
But maybe there's a further point to make, which is that in the time that Brecht was developing his ideas, there were different notions of audience, and there were different notions of what it is to be an individual member of an audience.
Yeah.
For example, in a way, one of the more extreme projects of his, Die Massnahme, in the name of the masses, proposes a group subject, which in the 30s and 40s, the idea that you are actually a member of a class and you're a member of this group and your individuality is less important than your role in the class struggle. That was always there behind his work. And I wonder, in a way, because you come from that tradition, even though you're not exactly in the direct Brechtian line, so to speak, how you see those strategies now, because in some ways your work wants to get the audience to engage critically and to, for example, think about the relation between the cinema apparatus, the construction of vision, and the mechanics of producing armaments, for example, in your vision projects, for example.
Yeah, I think you pointed out the decisive difference, that this utopian idea that there could arise something like a collectivity, not just a common denominator in humans, which makes them consumers also, but really a kind of a collective self. And even Freud was in those years, in some minutes, so enthusiastic that he said, perhaps the psyche can change with the communist experiment and so on. So he was first a skeptic, and because his belief was strong, he said, we are individuals, and now today, with today's technologies, of course, we become more and more individuals, meaning everybody has a device of his or her own on his ears, noses, and other bodily openings. And so probably this idea about collectivity is a decisive aspect, and that has totally changed, and I think nobody can hold it up anymore. And the analogies to a Brechtian method are so perhaps you have seen this work, Serious Games, which I'm showing in Berlin also. It's about, I will just briefly point it out, as American veterans, when they are traumatized by events at the war theater, they go to therapy, and there's a special device, a 3D animation, with which one can reconstruct the traumatic event, and then they are forced to retell this event. So it's a very strange thing. It's a little bit like externalizing a trauma, which we know so well from cinema, from Hitchcock film, that somebody is traumatized, and in the end you see the scene how Marnie kills the lover of her mother. Was it the father? Well, I don't know. But it was at least a man. It was a man. And in this case, you see these cheap 3D images which somehow claim to have this knowledge about the personality. So all of that is a role game, because just therapists are learning how to deal with these methods. So the people who say, I was in Iraq, they probably have never been to Iraq. They are role-playing with the experience and knowledge of their field. They are role-playing it, and these role plays remind me very much of Brecht's Lehrstücke or educational plays, because in both of them it's not so much the audience which should learn, but the performers should learn. So it's already filming it or watching it as if it were a performance is already a little bit of misreading, and that makes it all quite interesting. So perhaps after, in this complicated sense, there's still something Brechtian one can deal with.
No, I was thinking about that in the when I first saw the work that you had shown in MoMA last year, which engages with the Iraq War. And when you see it in the States as opposed to here, of course, you realize that the normal viewer is implicated in a number of ways. Not only are they more likely to be American citizens, but it's possible that either they or their family may have been called up and participated in the war, and that's rather different from seeing it in a European context. I wanted to, connected to this, talk a little bit about this movement that you've mentioned, in a way, from film through video and television to the installation form and video games. Because in a way, from the single screen, you have moved in a number of directions. On the one hand, the numbers of screens have increased, so you now work really with the installation form, multiple screen installation form, which we saw in Berlin, and I think we have here. But it's also moved sort of dimensionally into video games and a kind of 3D, 4D experience. Maybe you could just say a little bit about what took you in that direction.
So it was not a decision just from 95 on. Sometimes I got production means for the art space, and in 2000 that increased, and in retrospect I found out it's all quite simple. Let's say in Germany, I learned that some 1,000 museums opened in the last 30 years, and I don't know how many cinemas closed, but probably more in the last 30 years. So it's all quite normal and not astonishing that the moving image somehow found an exile in the art space. That happened in the last 20 years, I would say. So many people who come from this traditional underground movement, American filmmakers, Tony Conrad also, they are all now with galleries and show their work in art spaces, and that has simply to do with the fact that this parallel cinema system is dead. So there are still some cinemas in major cities, but if you go to a student club in the Americas or also in Europe, they will show student jokes or whatever, or perhaps they will show downloaded fancy stuff or whatever, but they will not show experimental films or whatever, what they did some 30 years ago. So that has totally died out. Probably it's easier to find a free jazz club than a place where films from Markopoulos or Klaus Liboni or whatever are shown.
But the thing is, I mean, I agree with you that in a way that whole system, production, distribution, exhibition, kind of collapsed, migrated into the art world. And a number of artists, including yourself, made that transition. I mean, obviously with a lot of work and thought and focus, but there were also a lot of people left behind who couldn't, like Klaus Liboni, for example, a lot of really very important avant-garde experimental filmmakers couldn't make this transition. And I think the reasons are complex. It's not just the economic, because it was also the collapse of a whole social system of screening, teaching with the films, and so on and so forth. And so I don't know whether you had a particular explanation as to how you managed to ride that wave, or from your perspective that actually it was still very difficult to make that transition.
Yeah. No, it is probably very difficult, and it's not predictable because there are so many features or niche existences. Same with filmmaking. Also, who would imagine that people like Huyer and Straub can produce for 50 years or so, and but there are filmmakers in the end who could make every project they wanted to make. Perhaps they were more successful than Stroheim and Kubrick also, who often failed with their projects. Okay, so it's very, I think it's very difficult to find why somehow it fits into a discourse or not. But I think that's only the practical aspect of it, that sociologically there's other aspects, that exhibition spaces. I think it started with, I'm not an expert in museology, but I think it started with Pompidou in the 70s, that the museum no longer was this terrible place where you had to go on Sundays with your grandmother or so, but it became this place where people from many formations are studying, some are hanging out, and it becomes somehow a parallel university, or a self-organized university, and also a club and so on. And so there are such spaces now, I would say, in every major European city. You can find them in Scandinavia, or in the Netherlands, or in Austria, even in small towns, and you immediately have this feeling that not such a boring archival place, but that there's really going on something. So let's say Kunstwerke in Berlin is such a place where you sense it immediately that there's some energy around it and so on. So that is one aspect. The other aspect is, of course, that with this massive overproduction, so everybody has access to 250 television channels, and then you have it on all these other devices where you can see moving images and so on. Then, of course, the kind of canon has to be recreated. So in the museum or art space, you have this feeling, at least for the fragment of a minute till you watch the work, that it is pre-selected and therefore has already some specialness and a certain value or so, that can end soon. But at least this context is very important for it, and otherwise this profession of the curator wouldn't have emerged in the way it did in the last 20, 30 years or so. I think that this one unbelievable overproduction needs this counterweight of creating an aura around the works and so on.
Yeah. And a number of your works do interrogate the structure of the cinematic image. Not so much, I would say, in terms of the aesthetic form, but more the means of production, the technologies of vision. And that's something that you've followed throughout your life. I mean, the thing that really struck me after Conrado invited me to meet with you, Conrado here invited me to meet with you and talk about your work, was then seeing these two exhibitions in Berlin, for example, how, in a way, consistent your vision has been. That is to say, it's been, I mean, I can think of a number of artists, filmmakers whose work has maybe changed over the years, whereas yours has actually been very consistent in the kinds of questions you're asking, even if you're using different media. I would say the questions of power and vision and who's in control, and the freedom that the individual member of the audience has or doesn't have. All those questions are there really from the beginning in the early work, and they continue in the video game analysis or in the discussions of the media in the Iraq War or the American prison system. But I was wondering whether we might talk a little bit about a different economic side of things, which is this shift from the film system, if you like, to the art world system.
Yeah.
And as you've said, you were encouraged by the availability of some production money, but also the institutions in which to show work.
Yeah.
And at what point did, I mean, I'm assuming that now when you were exhibiting with a gallery that your work is editioned and structured like most of the works that are presented here in the Loop Art Fair. When did that sort of first happen with you? When did you first get involved in gallery kind of exhibiting?
Yeah, so around the turn of the century, and I was so naive that I didn't know that you could have an edition. I thought if you sell it, it's sold, and so I signed the wrong contract. Also, but since then I know that you have to have an edition and keep one épreuve d'artiste for you, and all this stuff is known, and in many cases to sell work has helped to finance the next one, and because to avoid going too far into detail, I think that at the turn of the century, not only in Germany but generally, television has dramatically changed in Europe. Not also Channel 4 or Arte or earlier, it was possible to make films, to state simply documentaries without a commentary, for instance. That was possible to show them at least at 11:30 in a small channel or so. And nowadays, it's nearly unimaginable. So you know that 50 years ago, when direct cinema was invented, that was a huge advantage, that somehow you learn how to read a film, but nobody wants to have a feature film in which you get explained what you should see and think and what the meaning should be, only for the deaf mute, the subtitles and so on work this way. And but with documentaries, everybody grows up thinking there must be a text which leads me like the landing on stairs or whatever. And so with this commercial standardization of television, I think I'm lucky. So I could make a film 2 years ago again for television, and it was even broadcasted. But I hardly find means there. So there was not so much choice, but to try to find them there. And the interesting thing, it may be different for different people. I'm sure there are video makers who can say, I want to make X, Y, Z, and others raise their hands and throw over the means. Also, in my case, it doesn't work if I say I want to do something. I have to wait for the opportunity that somebody says, you can show and you can also produce something. And I say, I have a great idea, and so on. So I have to hide and to stall these ideas, and they have to come out when the opportunity is there, which is also interesting. It's a different kind of fishing. And it avoids these long exposés which you have to write for film funding. Yeah, these 40 pages on something you don't know shit about. That's all with these nice images from coffee shops and so on.
Yeah, it's a completely different system.
Yeah.
Maybe now we can see if there's some questions from for the audience, for Harun, on any of these topics, or other questions you might want to ask him. You don't have to, but
you don't have to.
Yeah.
We can't force.
Conrado said at the beginning. Yeah, there we are. Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you. I was wondering whether this transition from the, let's say, the cinema clubs to cinema theaters, to television, to galleries, whether you think that this changes or affects or just displaces or moves the political debates that your films are raised, and if you think that this happens, how do you think that happens? What kind of changes of debates? Because I feel that there's a difference between watching your films in a gallery and watching them in a cinema club in the 70s. But letting aside the time span, I was wondering about these new debates and new politics of the films because of the change of the context.
Yeah. So, first of all, I think that in cinemas in general, the spectator thinks, I know the code, why doesn't the film follow it? And in museums, by definition and education, it says you must find out which code is at work here. Yeah, that is minimalism. Oh, that is abstract expressionism or whatever. So that makes already a little difference, and it can also cause some kind of indifference. So I would say that since I'm in the art world, I never get a real critique. Nobody ever beats me up and says, but that is terrible and badly made and not well thought through, which all happened more or less when working for television and cinema. I don't know, there's, as if they, is it the old boys and old girls network? I have no idea. But there's this lack of critical engagement. So you,
But that sort of does take you back to the Brechtian discussion earlier, in the sense that Brecht's ideas were developed in relation to theatre, and the idea that we were all together in the same space, engaging with the performance. And in the cinema, you wouldn't have a live performance, you'd have the film, but nevertheless there was a group here, and then at the end, some people would stay behind and criticize you, the filmmaker, or engage with you. And so there was a kind of shared experience, whereas, as you say, in the gallery world, it's very rare to have that. Although I think it's changing even now. I mean, I think that the fact of events like this in art fairs suggest that all these different forms are coming together more.
No, so in general, the art gallery system is very, should I say, feudal, also festive. So there are a million opportunities so that the author has to be present nearly all the time, or to come to the finissage and to the vernissage. So it's not the standardized system which we have for cinema also. And so there is a lot of feedback on this side. That is true, of course. And it's also open. There's more openness than you have it in the movie system or television system.
So another question.
I'll try to formulate a question. I've seen your exhibition in Hamburg Bahnhof, and I was wondering if how do you approach the exhibition compared to approaching an installation, because it becomes a collection of installations and even some of your films. So it's a different way of seeing your films when you walk through a large space like that. How do you think about that in relation to making the installations, which I imagine are shown in galleries, and then looking at the total installation of the exhibition?
Mm-hmm. Now, the tricky thing about video art is if you don't just have one track which you show on a monitor or beam, then the question arises, if you show the image in an ideal way, you don't see the space anymore, then it's just like a dark cinema. And the reverse, if you see the space and other objects, then the projection quality is bad. And in Hamburger Bahnhof, it's nearly so dark, and we have these ideal conditions of carpet, and we could paint the ceiling or have people have, in the Brechtian sense, we didn't paint it. Obviously, others have painted it. Of course, that removes the spatial aspect, but what still remains is that these four parts are shown in a certain constellation, and the cross-references between images and sounds which are used in part number 1 and return in part number 3, perhaps only on the left track, and so on. This co-presence of these four chapters makes something different, and you have to walk from A to B because this montage is in a way spatial. Yeah, it's not only mental what you have to do when watching a film to remember what was said in the second minute because it relates to what happens in the 37th and so on. Still, I always tried, there are very few exceptions where I couldn't, I always tried to have also the works in a way that you can show them on a screen, one after the other. So, and in the case of Hamburger Bahnhof, you can acquire the DVDs, I think, for 10 euros or 5 euros or whatever. So it's or stream them. It's accessible for everybody, and you don't have to have this very expensive and complicated setting. So I find it quite important that you don't limit the things you produce to this lofty sphere.
Yeah. And so in a way you are also allowing works to exist in an unlimited public edition as well as through the artwork space.
Yeah, of course. That's very important.
When you were talking, I was remembering the exhibition that you did in Munster now.
Yeah, that's a while ago, yeah.
It's about 2000, where that was a very educational project, I would say, in quotation marks, in the sense that you distributed the images on a series of television monitors on school desks. And so you could watch you could engage with the individual screen, or you could move to the next one, but it was almost highlighting the sort of the pedagogic aspect of your work.
Exaggerating it.
Exaggerating it, yes. Whereas now it's a similar relationship. So in the Hamburger Bahnhof and the MoMA, installations are different, because in MoMA the audience had to walk through in order to get to another gallery, whereas in Hamburger Bahnhof they just come in and go out the same way. Nevertheless, you do have places for people to sit and engage with the single works.
We had it in New York too, but a bit less, a bit less.
Yeah. Maybe you have a question.
Moving from the film system into the art system, what did that mean for you in terms of influence and reaching audiences and kind of audiences?
It's very difficult to say. So on the one hand, it can be that you show something at night on television and you reach 30,000 people, which is an unimaginable number compared to us sitting here. And on the other hand, it's zero for the television industry, and they will never repeat it, and so on. Yeah. And on the other hand, if you show work in a museum, also every day many people pour in, and it can happen that people who would never consider watching a work of mine just by chance end up watching it, which I find interesting. Not only because I'm cynical, so I find it interesting, so especially in the MoMA, also, which is a little bit like a Disneyland. People come there with families, but they end up seeing a Bekoning or a video work or whatever, and they watch it, and perhaps they have never seen such a film, and that is wonderful. That's the same with Documenta, where also these huge families come for 3 days to really look at this, like a world exhibition 100 years ago or so. So therefore I can't say that in general the public in art spaces is snobbish or has too much pre-knowledge, or that the works in art galleries have to be esoteric. I don't think that is all true. I think the reverse can also be the case.
Yeah, it's a question just now.
What's your relationship to the internet then? Right now, I saw your work has been removed from Web. So what do you think about these type of initiatives, and how do you engage your work in these type of situations?
Some people are stealing and others are borrowing, and I always try to make a dime out of showing my work, and that is not possible with every platform, to state it carefully. The strong tendency to make everything available for free is understandable, and on an imaginary level, it's also the case that we remember music or quotations or whatever, and we don't have to pay for it every moment we quote it or whatever. On the other hand, if you want to produce, you can't always be too generous. I hope I hope I have your understanding. I get emails from people, obviously young people, and they say, your work XYZ is not, I can't find it in the web. And end of it. The implication is I must say, oh, I'm very sorry, can I send it to you, but in which continent are you living, or whatever. So that's an interesting approach.
Yeah. I mean, it was always a challenge, wasn't it? But in the film system, you would show your work in educational institutions, and they would pay for your visit, and they might pay for the hire of the film. Then with the development of VHS and DVD, people would also maybe buy even an unlimited copy, but then they would be using that for the next 20 or 30 years in some cases. And so there was never really much...
They would build their career on showing this VHS tape for 30 years.
So that there was no way of generating, as Harun was saying, the funds to develop new work. So it is I think for those artists and filmmakers who were brought up with that idea of being open to the public and making the work available, and then realizing that it's very difficult to make a living doing it in that way, so that it was necessary to have some kind of balance between, on the one hand, the art world limited edition projects, often commissioned in your case, and then the unlimited DVDs, which eventually will anyway be uploaded by somebody onto Vimeo or whatever. Is there another question? I was wondering, maybe, is there some project that you're working on now that you could like to tell us about, Harun, or maybe people here would like to help you fund and produce?
I think they should help me fund it without me telling what I want to do. I have deserved a carte blanche.
Exactly.
Now.
So you want a carte blanche for Harun. Okay.
Yeah. I can only allude. It could have to do something with drones, but I'm not yet sure.
With
drones.
Oh, drones.
Yeah. It's not about butterflies.
No. Okay.
Not about bees.
That's also the idea of video surveillance. I think a number of artists have done work, put cameras on drones, but yours would be a different project.
Put them on drones, That would be a bit different,
I was wondering whether you could tell us a little bit more about your involvement with video games. Are these, do you play them yourself?
No.
You don't?
No. But so the cycle of works which you can see in the gallery of Angels right now, it's installed there, that compares, it points not so much at the aspect of playing a game. In my opinion, these games are not very elaborate. I think that a chess game, other board games are more elaborate and more complex. But the aspect of the scenery resembles cinematographic sceneries and is strongly referring to them. So they have subgenres like the Western and the post-apocalyptic film and the L.A. noir genre and so on, of the 30s. So all these genres are around, and you, when playing, you are producing kind of sequences, and that I'm more looking at that aspect, not so much at the gaming aspect.
So that in a way, it is another area where the audience or the participant or the viewer is constructing or engaging. I think it's really an important area which we don't discuss enough, because in terms of the economics of video games, it's as important as the art world is, I think, or certainly in terms of cinema production, in terms of the way younger audiences are engaging with video games. And for whatever reason, there's very few artists. I mean, I can think of Fen Men Bo, for example, in China. Very few artists really find ways of working with that medium. And I sort of imagined you at home, a bit like Kevin Spacey in the House of Cards film, de-stressing by playing video games, but you don't do that, no.
We exploit the kids of collaborators.
Okay. But you should see that, because it's a kind of, in a way, it's a kind of survey of not just the aesthetics of video games, because you see them over a 20 to 30 year period, but also the different strategies of engagement. And now there's a small exhibition at the National Gallery in London which even talks about video games and Renaissance painting. So the interview, there's for example, a 30 or 40 strong team which abstracts procedures from Renaissance painting to use in a video game of ancient Rome, for example. So all these technologies and systems are coming much more together.
So that is the radical new about, I think, two aspects. The one is that even if we find them stylistically not overwhelming, this collaboration between decorative art and science is really unique, because we know that in times that painters once went to physiologists to find out how the body is built also, and nowadays they have access to 1 million of theoretical approaches. How do leaves sway in the wind, or how does the water drops fall, or all these aspects in detail. And the other thing is, of course, that also if we may have not such a high opinion about using a joystick and so on, obviously it is very meaningful for the participants, because otherwise they would not accept to see the images they see, which are nearly uncut, long shots, which you would never accept to have in a commercial film. There the frequency is, after 3 seconds there has to be a cut, otherwise people younger than 45 will not watch the film anymore, or not pay for it at least. And suddenly they accept it. They accept these, one could say, surveillance camera-like images which they get there, because they can navigate on their own. So obviously this act that you are the one who can point the camera to one side or the other is very, very meaningful. And perhaps that is the first moment where you empower the audience, which is, at least formally.
Or maybe that's a kind of good point to finish on. Or was there a question there from? Okay. Yeah.
But it's a good point.
We can still
Hi.
come back to it. Yeah.
Sorry, I'm not sure it's a question, but I just wanted to ask you to develop a little bit more on your reflection on like video games, because I think you said something really interesting about how they borrow to cinema and all these cinematic scenes. And when you make this parallel with chess as well as video game and chess being a much more complex games. And I think, I don't know, I'm not an expert on video games, but there's something in this parallel with like cinema where the player is kind of like a spectator and a player at the same time. But there is, from my opinion, a very strong like simplification of the reality. And it's basically you're the player of like a very, like you're actor of your own character, but in a very simplified kind of life. And I don't know, like just in regard to your work and to like your interest towards like the real and in comparison to the virtual, I don't know if you could develop a bit around this question or reflection.
Yeah, so mainly I agree. So if one makes a distinction between game and play, if you look at a chess game, it doesn't help so much how these stones are carved. This playful aspect is quite reduced, and in the video game, the reverse is mostly the case. Yeah, that the rules are very simple. If you hit a monster will come or whatever, and if you hit the monster, the next monster will come, and it's very, very simple. Also, the dramaturgy also of elaborate films can be quite simple, and you could also sometimes reduce it to very few aspects. But if the narration is smart or works with contingency, suddenly you look at the face of the main actor and can't read it anymore, and that also can happen in these video games. Also, they're very reductive narration-wise. Strange constellations emerge. I hope I have filtered some out and you can see them. So this hold up with the woman or whatever, these strange stoic faces they are making, and when they have no line how to react or whatever, and no action. Also, other narrational aspects perhaps come into view then.
Yeah. Well, I mean, we could talk. There's so many topics we could pursue, but there are a number of other discussion events these next days.
Yeah.
And Harun will be here for a few days more, where you can.
No, we are leaving today.
Oh, okay. All right. So then you have to get him after. You find him after this session to. Great. Well, thank you all very much. Thank you, especially to Harun.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Mark.